The air in the Valia Umbrella tasted of damp earth and ancient stone, a chill that settled not just on the skin but deep within the bone. It clung to everything, especially the house. Not merely a house, of course, but Citadia Noptii, the fortress of night, perched like a brooding vulture above the valley mist. Its stone walls, blackened by centuries of rain and shadow, seemed to absorb the weak sunlight, leaving the world around it perpetually dim. Beyond the nearest stands of skeletal fir trees, the mountains rose like jagged teeth against a perpetually bruised sky. I had returned because there was nowhere else to go. Prague, with its gaslit streets and learned halls, had felt utterly alien. The whispers of history there were polite, contained within museum walls and dusty archives. Here, history breathed, a heavy, suffocating presence that lived in the very stones of my ancestral home. Uncle Johan, my mother's reclusive brother, had raised me within these walls after the plague took my parents. He was a scholar, a man who preferred the company of crumbling manuscripts to living souls, and he filled my childhood with tales of our family's long, peculiar lineage. When I was old enough, he had sent me away, insisting I gain worldly perspective, though I suspected he simply wished for uninterrupted silence. But worldly perspective felt hollow. The manor, for all its oppressive silence, at least felt real. Returning meant inheriting that silence, and the echoing vastness of Citadia Noptii. It was a monstrous structure, a chaotic tapestry of architectural styles woven together over 500 years. Gothic arches met Renaissance facades, which abutted strangely blank sections that defied categorization. Yet, despite its age and the brutal weather of the Carpathians, there was a disturbing lack of decay. No crumbling mortar, no rotting timbers, only a profound, unnatural stillness that suggested time moved differently here, or perhaps didn't move at all for certain parts of the house. I chose to inhabit Uncle Johan's rooms, a modest suite tucked away in a less imposing wing. His personal library remained, row upon row of forgotten knowledge, and I spent my first weeks simply wandering, trying to reacquaint myself with the labyrinth. The manor was a museum of eccentricity. Portraits with unsettling eyes seemed to follow me. Cabinets overflowed with bizarre artifacts, mummified animal parts, strange alchemical equipment, navigational tools that pointed nowhere recognizable. Each object told a story, or hinted at one, adding layers to the weight of the past that pressed down on me. My childhood fascination with our family tree, spurred by Uncle Johan's fragmented stories, resurfaced with a new intensity. Our lineage was long, but riddled with gaps, whispers, and inconveniently missing records. The figure who haunted my research most was the founder, Lord Grigor Vasiliev, who had begun the fortress in the late 15th century. Uncle Johan had spoken of him often, a man of immense wealth acquired through exploration and collecting, a scholar dabbling in sciences both known and suspected. But concrete details were scarce. There were no reliable portraits, only conflicting descriptions, and the persistent legend of a hidden study, a sanctum where his most prized possessions and forbidden knowledge were kept, somewhere deep within the oldest parts of the manor. A place rumored to contain the only true depiction of the man himself. Locating Lord Grigor's study became an obsession. The manor's architecture was already confusing, but the available blueprints were worse. They were numerous, wildly contradictory, and often depicted rooms or entire sections that simply did not exist, or conversely, failed to show parts of the manor that clearly did. It was a cartographer's nightmare, a house that defied logical mapping. As my search consumed me, the dreams began. At first, they were vague, unsettling glimpses of long, dark corridors and locked doors. Then they grew sharper, more vivid, and infinitely more terrifying. I would find myself in a vast, echoing hall, lined with countless doors of strange woods and metals. Behind some, I would see glimpses of scenes that curdled the blood, figures hunched over steaming cauldrons, walls etched with symbols that writhed like living things, shapes that were undeniably flesh and bone but assembled in ways nature never intended. Forbidden rituals performed in flickering torchlight, the low chant of names that scraped against the soul. I would wake trembling, the images seared into my mind, the heavy, metallic scent of the dream hall still in my nostrils. Driven by the need to understand, or perhaps just to find the source of this haunting legacy, I devoted myself to creating a definitive map. I cross-referenced the insane blueprints, walked every corridor multiple times, measuring, noting discrepancies, searching for hidden passages Uncle Johan might have mentioned or hinted at. It was a painstaking, exhausting process that took months, but slowly, painstakingly, a pattern emerged from the chaos. A central core, hinted at in the oldest, most fantastical plans, which seemed to be the origin point of the manor's many expansions. I became convinced this was where Lord Grigor's study lay hidden. Following my own carefully drawn map felt like descending into the manor's true heart. I navigated corridors that grew narrower and darker, through rooms whose furnishings predated any other part of the house, where the air was colder, heavier. The very stone felt different here, rougher, older, pulsing with a faint, almost inaudible hum. My map led me to a small, bare chamber, unlike the opulent rooms I had passed. And there, set into the far wall, was the door. It was enormous, crafted from iron-banded oak, and thick with carvings. At first glance, they seemed to depict familiar scenes, figures from local folklore, distorted religious iconography. But the longer I looked, the more unsettling details emerged. Hidden within the swirling patterns of vines and saints were creatures of nightmare, their forms subtly blended into the wood grain, their eyes hollow knots, their limbs intertwined with foliage in disturbing ways. A shepherd leading his flock transformed into a figure herding malformed, bleeding horrors. An angel had insectal wings hidden beneath its robes. The door had no handle, only a complex mechanism of interlocking metal plates. Remembering a cryptic passage in Uncle Johan's notes about the key of alignment, I manipulated the plates according to a sequence I had painstakingly deduced from old family symbols. With a deep, groaning sigh of ancient wood and rusted iron, the heavy door swung inward. I peered into the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting the dusty, artifact-filled chamber of a 15th-century scholar, perhaps with a single, revealing portrait on the wall. Instead, I saw only a void, from which emerged the damp, earthy smell I associated with the valley's crypts. And then, my lamp's beam found the first step of a spiral staircase, carved directly into the stone, winding downwards into the Stygian blackness below. There was no sign of a study, no desk, no portrait. Just a descent into the unknown. A morbid curiosity, colder than the valley air, gripped me. My map ended here. But the manor, Citadia Nuptiae, clearly had deeper secrets yet to reveal. Taking a breath that did little to calm my racing pulse, I placed my foot on the first cold step and began to descend. The old woman's eyes, like chips of obsidian, fixed on mine, and a low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in my very bones. I froze, every muscle locked in place. My breath hitched in my throat, caught somewhere between a gasp and a scream. The sound wasn't loud, yet it filled the small space around the smoldering fire pit, pushing against my eardrums, resonating deep within my chest. It was a sound that spoke of something ancient, something deeply unsettling, like the groan of the earth or the voice of a creature not meant to be heard. Just as quickly as it began, it faded, dissolving back into the constant, pulsating hum of the jungle night. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with an unspoken presence. Nana Salma slowly lowered her head, her gaze dropping from mine to the glowing embers. Her face, a map of deep wrinkles etched by time and sun, settled back into its usual passive expression, but the intensity one had seen in her eyes, the raw, unsettling energy behind that sound, lingered in my mind like a phantom limb. "Nana, what was that?" I managed to croak out, the words feeling clumsy and weak in the thick air. My Bahasa Malayu, usually adequate for basic conversation, felt utterly insufficient now. She didn't look up. She simply reached a gnarled hand towards a pile of dried leaves beside her and slowly added a few to the fire. A thin plume of smoke curled upwards, carrying the scent of burning wood and something else, something musky and strange, perhaps the herbs she used in her remedies. I stood there for another moment, rooted to the spot, my heart hammering against my ribs. The inexplicable vibration still seemed to echo within me, a phantom tremor. The moment felt both fleeting and eternal. It was clear she wasn't going to offer an explanation. The connection, the brief, terrifying glimpse into something I didn't understand, was over. I felt like a child who had accidentally stumbled upon a sacred ritual and was now being quietly but firmly ushered away. Muttering a quiet, "Terima kasih, Nana," I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the ground, the sense of unease clinging to me like the humid air. I turned and began walking back towards the center of the kampung, the small collection of stilted houses nestled precariously between the encroaching jungle and a narrow, winding river. The path was barely visible in the dim light filtering down from the few scattered lamps. The air was thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of heat and moisture. The usual symphony of the rainforest at night, the incessant chirping of cicadas, the croaking of frogs, the distant chatter of monkeys, seemed amplified tonight, each sound distinct and unnerving. Every rustle in the dense undergrowth bordering the path made me flinch, my mind conjuring shapes in the shadows. As I passed the simple wooden houses, I noticed figures silhouetted in doorways or peeking from behind woven bamboo screens. They didn't call out greetings as they sometimes did. They just watched. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel their eyes on me, silent and unreadable. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but it was watchful, wary. I was the outsider, the one who didn't belong, the one who perhaps had seen or heard something I shouldn't have. I reached the small hut that had been provided for my stay, a simple structure on stilts, about the size of a single room. It offered little protection from the elements or, it seemed, from the unseen. Inside, the air was even hotter and heavier. I closed the thin wooden door behind me, the latch clicking with a sound that seemed ridiculously fragile. I lit the small kerosene lamp, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. The space was sparse, a thin mattress on the floor covered by a mosquito net, a small table, a chair. The open windows were covered only by wire mesh, offering no barrier to the sounds of the jungle pressing in from all sides. I peeled off my sweat-soaked clothes, feeling sticky and gritty. I splashed cool water from a bucket over my face and neck, trying to wash away the lingering sense of dread. But it wasn't just physical grime. The unsettling feeling from the encounter with Nana Salma was psychological, digging its claws deep. I lay down on the mattress under the mosquito net, the thin fabric a fragile barrier between me and the buzzing, skittering world outside. Sleep felt impossible. My mind replayed the old woman's eyes, the strange sound that had resonated within me. What was it? Some kind of ritualistic vocalization? A warning? Or something else entirely? I had come to Kampung Tersembunyi to study the unique dialect spoken by the Orang Asli community here, drawn by the remoteness and the promise of linguistic isolation that preserved older forms of language. I had expected challenges: the heat, the insects, the cultural differences. I had read about the rich folklore, tales of forest spirits, mythical creatures, and the deep connection they felt to the land and its unseen dwellers. I had filed it all away as fascinating cultural data, interesting for my research, but not as something real, something that could actually intrude upon my rational, scientific world. But tonight, rational thought felt inadequate. The silence of the villagers, their sudden guardedness whenever the conversation edged towards the Hutan jungle after dark, or the orang lama, old people/ancestors, took on a new, ominous meaning. I remembered hearing fragments of hushed conversations around the fire pit earlier in the week, mentioning Panungu, the spirit guardian said to inhabit ancient trees or specific locations. At the time, I'd just made a note of the term for my lexicon. Now, the word felt heavy with foreboding. The sounds outside shifted. The general hum of insects and frogs seemed to recede, replaced by something more distinct, more deliberate. A soft tapping began. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from directly beneath the hut, near the stilts supporting the structure. It wasn't random, like an animal rooting around. It had a rhythm, slow and steady. My body tensed, every nerve ending firing. I held my breath, straining my ears over the pounding of my own heart. Tap, tap, tap. It paused, then resumed, perhaps slightly closer. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. A rat? A civet cat? But the sound wasn't quite right for claws or paws. It sounded softer, duller, like knuckles gently rapping on wood. Tap, tap, scrape. A new sound, like something dragging itself along the wooden support beam just below the floorboards. It was slow, deliberate, heavier than the tapping. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my scientific detachment. I slowly, carefully, reached for the powerful flashlight I kept beside my bed. My hand was shaking. The tapping resumed, relentless, beneath me. The scraping followed. It sounded like something was trying to climb. The air in the small, hidden compartment felt unnaturally dry, carrying a scent that was neither simply dust nor decay, but something sharp and metallic, like old blood mixed with dried herbs. Sarah's fingers recoiled from the brittle bundle of twigs tied with horsehair. Beside it lay a small, crudely carved wooden figure, its eyes vacant holes, and a single, yellowed human tooth. These were not forgotten trinkets. They were deliberate, placed with care in the recess behind the loose panel in the bedroom wall. Mark stood behind her, his breath catching in his throat. What is that?" His voice was low, unsteady. He'd been skeptical about renting this remote house, buried deep in the Valkavian mountains, but Sarah had been drawn to its ancient stone walls and the promise of undisturbed peace. Now, the peace felt less like tranquility and more like a heavy, watchful silence. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She felt a chill creep up her spine, a primitive fear that had nothing to do with logic. The house had felt old, yes, but not wrong until now. It had creaked and settled like any old building, but the discovery of these objects felt like finding a hidden wound. She carefully nudged the wooden figure with her fingertip. It was cold, despite the stuffy air. "I don't know," she whispered, turning to Mark. His face was pale in the faint light filtering from the window. Why would anyone hide these things? Maybe they were just old superstitions? Mark offered, though his eyes darted around the room as if expecting something to manifest from the shadows. Charms or something? Charms for what? And hidden like this? Sarah shivered. The small collection felt intensely personal and deeply unsettling. It wasn't just dusty history, It felt like a secret that was never meant to be found. They closed the panel again, sliding the wood back into place with a soft click that echoed unervingly in the sudden silence. But the room felt different now. The shadows seemed deeper, clinging to the corners like damp moss. The usual creaks of the house no longer sounded like settling wood, but like hesitant footsteps overhead or along the corridor. They retreated to the living room, the largest space in the house, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that smelled faintly of old ash and something earthy. Outside, the perpetual twilight of the mountains was deepening into full night. The wind picked up, whistling around the ancient eaves and rattling the panes of the small, leaded windows. "Maybe we should call the agent," Mark suggested, pulling his phone out. He frowned. No signal. Of course. Sarah hugged her arms to herself. There must be some explanation. This area, it's known for its old traditions, right? Maybe it's related to some local belief. She tried to sound rational, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of the few interactions they'd had with the villagers down the winding mountain road, the wary eyes, the quick dismissal of questions about the house. They'd been told it was simply old and empty for many years. No mention of hidden compartments or unsettling artifacts. A loud rap sounded somewhere in the house. Both of them froze. It wasn't the wind, it was sharp, distinct, like knuckles on wood. They stared at each other, eyes wide. "Upstairs?" Mark mouthed. Sarah nodded, listening intently. The sound didn't repeat, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The silence that followed the rap was heavy, expectant. They tried to distract themselves, lighting the oil lamp on the table, the flickering glow casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. The smell of paraffin joined the medley of old house scents. They spoke in low tones, recounting their day trip to the nearest town, trying to recapture the feeling of normal tourism. But the unease gnawed at them. Every creak was amplified, every rustle of leaves outside sounded like something trying to get in. Then came the scratching. It started faintly, seemingly from inside the walls of the living room itself. A soft, persistent skittering, like claws on plaster. Mark went to the wall, pressing his ear against it. "Probably just rats," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the sound wasn't the quick scurrying of rodents. It was slower, more deliberate, moving along the wall towards the fireplace. As it drew closer, it changed, the scratching became heavier, punctuated by a wet, dragging noise. It sounded less like an animal and more like something heavy being pulled across a rough surface. Sarah felt her stomach clench. "That's not rats, Mark." The scratching stopped abruptly near the fireplace. A moment of absolute silence hung in the air. Then, from the chimney, came a low moan. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was deep, guttural, filled with an ancient sorrow or perhaps something far worse. It seemed to resonate within the very stones of the house. The oil lamp on the table flickered violently, threatening to go out. The shadows around them seemed to writhe. Sarah clutched Mark's arm, her nails digging into his skin. His face was ashen, all traces of skepticism gone. The moan faded, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing and the relentless wind outside. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they were no longer alone in the house, and whatever else was here, it had been woken. The small wooden doll lay on the crisp white pillowcase, stark against the clean fabric. It was roughly carved, perhaps 6 inches long, shaped like a person but crude, almost deliberately so. Its limbs were rigid pegs, its body a block. The head was rounded, featureless save for 2 tiny dots of black paint or charcoal for eyes. They stared blankly upwards, towards the dark ceiling beams. Anya felt a cold dread pool in her stomach. It hadn't been there when she'd pulled back the covers mere moments before. She was certain. She hadn't been out of the room long, just downstairs to ask Liam about the flickering lamp. Her hand trembled as she reached out, not quite touching it. The wood looked old, worn smooth in places as if handled often. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent clinging to it, something earthy and unfamiliar, like damp soil mixed with dried herbs. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt wrong, deeply wrong, in the sterile tidiness of their rented room in this old guest house. The guest house stood on the edge of the small village, nestled precariously in the hills, a place they had chosen for its authentic isolation. Now, the isolation felt less charming and more like a cage. She snatched her hand back as if burned. Who? How? The window was latched from the inside. The door had been locked. They were the only guests. The elderly couple who ran the place seemed frail and quiet, their faces etched with the weariness of hard lives, their eyes holding a depth of sadness she couldn't fathom. They spoke little English, and her few phrases of their language were useless for explaining something like this. A doll appearing in her locked room? It sounded insane even to her. A shiver ran down her spine. She glanced around the room frantically. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, thicker than before. The familiar shapes of the furniture twisted in her peripheral vision. Was someone here? Hiding? She held her breath, listening. The only sounds were the distant, mournful hoot of an owl and the rustle of wind through the trees outside. The house itself was silent, the floorboards not protesting, the old wood walls holding their secrets close. She backed away from the bed, her eyes fixed on the doll. It felt like it was watching her, those two painted dots somehow conveying an unnerving awareness. It wasn't just a doll, it felt deliberate. A message. But what message? And from whom? Panic started to bubble in her chest. She needed Liam. He was downstairs, trying to fix the lamp or perhaps talking to the guesthouse owners with his slightly better grasp of the local tongue. She turned and fumbled for the doorknob, her fingers slipping on the cold metal. Downstairs, the air felt heavy, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something else, something sharper. Liam was sitting by the large, dark fireplace, looking frustrated. "Can't get the lamp to stay lit," he said without looking up. "Keep blowing out. Weird." Owners just shrugged. "Liam," she managed, her voice a little shaky. "Upstairs. In my room." "Something?" He finally looked up, seeing her face. His casual expression vanished. "What? What's wrong?" There's a doll. On my pillow. It wasn't there before. My door was locked, the window too." Liam frowned, a skeptical line forming between his brows. "A doll? Are you sure? Maybe you just didn't notice it?" "I'm sure," Anya insisted, the tremor in her voice more pronounced now. "I was just in there. It just appeared." He stood up slowly, his initial skepticism giving way to concern at her obvious distress. "Okay. Let's go see." They went back upstairs, the old wooden stairs groaning under their weight in the oppressive silence of the house. The hallway was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight through a high window. When they entered her room, Anya pointed towards the bed. The doll was still there, lying exactly as she had left it, staring up at the ceiling. Liam walked over, his footsteps surprisingly loud on the floorboards. He bent down, his hand hovering over it. "Ha," he murmured, his tone a mix of bewilderment and unease. He picked it up. It was smaller in his large hand, looking even more crude up close. He turned it over. Just a piece of wood. No strings, no mechanism. But how did it get there? Anya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Liam, the room was locked." He turned the doll again, examining the base. I don't know, Anya. Maybe one of the owners. Why would they do that? A strange custom? A local tradition? I don't know, he admitted, his voice losing its edge of logic, replaced by a growing confusion. He looked at the doll's face, or lack thereof, and then back at Anya, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. The calm, practical Liam was gone, replaced by someone unsettled. He placed the doll back on the pillow. Okay. It's weird. Really weird. Are you sure you locked the door when you went down? Yes. I always do. And the window is latched. She walked over to the window, a simple wooden frame with a metal hook. It was securely fastened. See? Liam checked the door lock. It was an old-fashioned bolt. He slid it back and forth. It works, he said, a note of helplessness in his voice. I don't understand. They stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. The doll lay between them, a silent, menacing presence. The faint earthy smell seemed stronger now, or perhaps Anya was imagining it. It smelled like the forest floor after rain, damp and fertile, but with an undertow of decay. A sudden, sharp sound outside made them both jump. Scratch, scratch. It came from directly outside the window, just below the sill. It sounded like fingernails scraping against the rough stone wall of the house. Slow, deliberate. Scratch. Scratch. Their eyes met, wide with shared fear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. Scratch. Scratch. It stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Deeper, more absolute. It felt like everything outside was holding its breath, waiting. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. Anya found herself unable to move, rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the window, then darting back to the doll on the bed. The doll hadn't moved. But somehow, its dark, painted eyes seemed to be looking directly at the window now. The smear was dark, viscous-looking, painted in a crude spiral that seemed to pull the eye inward. Sarah knelt on the dusty tatami mat, her breath catching in her throat. It was on the inside of the small closet door, hidden away. Not something left casually. It looked like dried blood, thick and almost black in the dim light filtering from the hallway. It wasn't geometric, nothing clean or modern. It was organic, twisting like roots or veins, forming a symbol she didn't recognize from any art or scripture. It smelled faintly metallic, but also something else, something earthy and unpleasant, like damp soil mixed with decay. Her hand trembled as she reached out, hesitating just inches away. Her rational mind screamed old paint, children's drawing, some forgotten repair work. But the feeling in the pit of her stomach was cold, heavy dread. It felt deliberate. It felt wrong. It felt ancient. She'd come to this remote corner of Japan seeking peace, a place to write, drawn by the promise of untouched nature and quiet village life. The old Kaminka had seemed perfect, nestled on the edge of the forest, far from the city noise. The villagers were polite, reserved, but their smiles sometimes didn't quite reach their eyes. Now, finding this hidden mark, she felt a wave of chilling isolation. She fumbled for the small cloth she kept in her pocket, using it to wipe down surfaces when she'd been cleaning. She dabbed hesitantly at the symbol. It didn't come off easily. It smeared, the dark pigment stretching across the old wood grain, leaving a faint, stubborn residue that seemed to sink deeper into the pores of the wood. It was as if the wood itself didn't want to let it go. A shiver ran down her spine, unrelated to the cooling evening air. This wasn't paint. Not ordinary paint, at least. She stood slowly, her knees protesting from kneeling. The small closet felt suddenly suffocating. She backed out, leaving the door ajar, unable to bring herself to close it entirely, yet not wanting to look at the disturbing mark either. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. The silence of the old house, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, expectant. The wind rustled the bamboo outside, a sound that was usually soothing, but tonight it sounded like whispering voices, sharp and dry. Gata gata, went the old shoji screens rattling softly in their frames, a familiar sound that now felt like an intrusion, a warning. She moved back towards the center of the room, her eyes scanning the familiar objects that now seemed foreign, menacing in the growing twilight. The worn tatami mats, the dark wooden pillars, the simple low table. Had she ever really felt alone here, or had she been oblivious? She thought of the old woman in the village who had given her a single, sharp look when Sarah mentioned where she was staying. The way conversations would suddenly drop when she approached a group of villagers. She had attributed it to their natural reserve, the wariness of an outsider. Now she wondered if it was something else. Fear. Pity. A faint sound drifted from outside the house. Not the wind. Something else. A low murmur, distant but distinct. It sounded like chanting. Repetitive, rhythmic, unlike anything she'd heard from the nearby temple. It seemed to come from the direction of the dense woods behind the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She told herself it was just the wind, or perhaps some local festival she hadn't been informed about. But the sound had a quality that felt ancient, solemn, and deeply unsettling. It raised the hairs on her arms. She walked quietly to the window, peering through the glass panels of the old frame. The forest was a black, impenetrable wall against the fading light. She could see nothing, only the shifting shapes of leaves and branches as the wind moved through them. The chanting stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the silence even more profound and unnerving. Had she imagined it? Her ears strained, listening for any return of the sound. Only the wind, the creaking of the house, and the frantic thumping of her own pulse filled the air. Her gaze fell back on the small closet door, still slightly open. The dark smear seemed to pulse in the dim light, though she knew it was just her eyes playing tricks, or perhaps the way the last rays of light caught the dried pigment. She felt a growing certainty, a cold dread settling deep in her bones. This symbol wasn't just a mark. It was connected to the sounds outside. It was connected to this place, this house, this village. And it felt like it was meant to ward something off. Or perhaps, to invite something in. She needed to get out. To call someone. But her phone signal in this remote valley was notoriously unreliable. She could walk to the village, but that felt like plunging deeper into the unknown, towards the unsettling source of the chanting. The house felt like a trap, but also the only place she knew. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the hallway. It wasn't the house settling, or the wind. It sounded like wood groaning under pressure, or a heavy door shifting. Sarah froze, every muscle tensing. She was alone in the house. She had locked the front door hours ago. Then she heard it. A soft thud, followed by another. Slow, deliberate. Footsteps. They were coming from the direction of the front hallway, moving steadily towards the main room where she stood. They weren't the light tread of an animal, or the creaks of an empty house. These were heavy, purposeful steps, measured and slow, advancing through the oppressive silence. Someone, or something, was inside the house with her. The ancient wooden door creaked open, revealing not the expected darkness, but a single, impossibly large, unblinking eye staring out from the void within. My breath hitched, a choked gasp caught in my throat. It was unlike any I had ever seen. The iris was a swirling vortex of bruised purples and sickly yellows, contracting slightly in the faint light filtering from my lantern held aloft. The pupil was a bottomless pit, a perfect, terrifying black that seemed to swallow the light whole. Surrounding it, the scara was not white, but a mottled, diseased gray, crisscrossed with thick, veiny tendrils that pulsed faintly. An unnatural cold radiated from the doorway, a damp, bone-chilling air that carried a scent I couldn't place, not just mold or decay, but something metallic, like old blood mixed with stagnant water and the dry dust of ages. My grip tightened on the lantern until my knuckles were white. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot on the dusty tatami floor of the long, narrow hallway. The old house, normally full of the creaks and groans of settling wood, was unnervingly silent now, as if even the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. This was the room the villagers had warned me about in hushed tones, the one they said was best left undisturbed, the one at the very end of the long, seldom used wing. They spoke of bad luck, of the spirits of the house being displeased, of Mono that watched from the shadows. I had dismissed it as simple superstition, the kind of folklore that clung to remote places like this mountain village, untouched by the modern world. Now, faced with that impossible eye, the warnings felt like urgent cries in the dark. The eye didn't move from its fixed gaze on me, yet I felt scrutinized, judged, known. It wasn't just looking at me, it felt like it was looking into me, peeling back layers I kept hidden even from myself. The faint light of the lantern seemed to illuminate nothing behind the eye, only an infinite, consuming blackness. Was it attached to a body? A creature? Or was the eye itself the entity, a single point of awareness staring out from somewhere else entirely? A low sound emerged from the void behind the eye, a wet, scraping whisper that sounded like something heavy being dragged across rough stone, punctuated by a soft, rhythmic slap that made my skin crawl. It was deliberate, unhurried, the sound of something ponderous and ancient beginning to stir. Instinct finally overruled paralysis. My mind screamed to run, to turn and flee back down the hallway, out of this cursed house, away from this mountain village and its suffocating secrets. I took a shaky step back, my worn wooden get-a sandals scraping softly on the tatami. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. The eye reacted. It didn't blink this time, but the pupil constricted further, and the eye shifted minutely, tracking my movement. Then, slowly, inexorably, the ancient door began to open wider on its protesting hinges. It wasn't being pushed from the outside, but from within the void. A dark shape began to become visible just inside the frame, indistinct in the gloom but undeniably there. It was massive, filling the lower portion of the doorway. I saw a hint of a dark, scaled surface, wet and glistening in the faint light, like the skin of some colossal amphibian or reptile. The scraping sound intensified, growing louder, closer. The smell of blood and stagnant water grew stronger, thick and cloying in the air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. Every fiber of my being screamed to flee, but my legs felt heavy, unresponsive. The floorboards beneath me seemed to shift and groan not from age, but as if the house itself was recoiling from what was emerging from the room. The dark shape moved again, pushing the door open just a little more. Now I could see more detail, not just scales, but segments, like some monstrous, segmented worm or serpent, impossibly huge, coiled within the small room. The eye remained fixed on me, the only visible feature from higher up. The slap sound happened again, softer this time, accompanied by a faint sucking noise. What was making that sound? Terror, pure and unadulterated, washed over me, stealing my breath. This wasn't folklore, this was real, tangible horror slithering out of the dark heart of this ancient place. The thing in the doorway began to flow forward, slowly, deliberately, like dark, viscous liquid pouring from a tilted vessel. The scaled segments pressed against the doorframe, scraping loudly. The giant eye dipped slightly as the mass moved. It was emerging.